Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. For those of you who don't know me, my name is John Brandon. I'm Senior Director for International Relations Programs for the Asia Foundation here in Washington, and I'm very pleased to welcome you this afternoon to our program that addresses ASEAN Centrality and Regional Development Cooperation. Most ASEAN meetings in Washington tend to focus on the political security and economic sides of how the grouping fits into overall Asian regional architecture, such as the East Asia Summit, the ASEAN Regional Forum, the ASEAN Defense Ministers Meeting Plus, as well as the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Forum. But rarely do we touch on ASEAN and its potential in strengthening regional development. Historically, ASEAN countries have been recipients of foreign aid, and certainly that's indeed the case for countries today such as Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, Vietnam. But as given the rapid economic development over the decades, some of the countries have risen to advanced middle income status, and in particular countries like Thailand and Malaysia and needless to say, Singapore. But what we're going to have a discussion today is to talk about how ASEAN countries, or some ASEAN countries, can assist others in sort of raising all boats, given the diversity in political and economic development in the region. The Foundation has recently produced this report. This is my only prop of the day. ASEAN as the Architect for Regional Development, Advancing ASEAN Centrality and Catalyzing Action for Sustainable Development. And the Foundation is pleased to have two of the principal authors here today. Thomas Parks, our country representative, Asia Foundation in Thailand, based in Bangkok, and Mr. Apichai Sunchindah, who's an independent development specialist as well as a senior researcher for the Asia Foundation. Tom has lived in Thailand for more than a decade. He's been our country representative for about a year and a half, but he has had a lot of experience in other capacities, both within the foundation. He was most notably our person who managed our conflict programs, but for a 5-year period, he worked for Australia DFAT. He's recently the author of an important study that we did on U.S.-Thailand relations, and about 5 years ago, he also authored a very well-regarded study called Contested Corners of Asia, Subnational Conflict and International Development Assistance. He is no stranger to Washington. He received his master's degree here down the street at the School of Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins, and has received his bachelor's from Harvard. Kun Apichai has been a development specialist for about 4 decades. He started his career as a researcher on interdisciplinary development-oriented projects for the Asian Institute of Technology, which is just based north of Bangkok. He held over the years several assignments with Bangkok-based development cooperation agencies for Australia, the United States, Switzerland, and most recently Germany. He has spent about half of his professional career working in the ASEAN Secretariat or the ASEAN Foundation, both of which are located in Jakarta. And he's also worked in the Office of the United Nations Residence Coordinator in Bangkok. He's a keen observer of development issues, particularly not just in ASEAN, but particularly in the Mekong sub-region, with a focus in recent years in capacity building and institutional strengthening activities of various organizations and entities. He received his bachelor's degree in biology and as well as his master's degree in water resources management, both from the University of Wisconsin. Madison. And so with that introduction, I will now turn it over to Tom. We'll probably, their presentations will last probably approximately about 30 minutes, and the remainder of that time, we look forward to the discussion and comments. So Tom, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Thanks to all of you for joining us today. Apichai and I just actually arrived from New York. We were presenting this yesterday at a side event around the UN General Assembly meeting hosted by the Rockefeller Foundation, and a lot of interest there. It was actually hosted by the Rockefeller Foundation, but we were joined as well by the ASEAN Secretary General Datu Lim Jak Hoi, as well as the Thai Deputy Foreign Minister, Virasak. So we've had some good profile for this so far. It just came out yesterday, actually. So we're very happy to have a chance to speak with all of you about it. Let us just walk through what we're trying to accomplish today, and we'll look forward to a nice, lengthy, hopefully, Q&A session. So this project began in many ways as an effort by an international foundation and INGO to try to understand ASEAN, try to understand how it works, and to try to see if we could do more to actually work with them directly through the formal channels. We have worked with ASEAN in various capacities, often on a Track 2 level for decades, but have had challenges trying to work with ASEAN through Track 1 or to work directly with the Secretariat. We've supported many ministries of foreign affairs over the years, but have done actually not that much with the Secretariat. So our goal initially was to think about how can we do more with ASEAN, and how can we understand it better sort of in the process. But what ended up happening was the program evolved to be much more of a focus on looking at the potential for ASEAN, given trends in development assistance in Southeast Asia, to look at how ASEAN could potentially play a more strategic role in an area that, frankly, it doesn't play much of a role right now. So this is certainly more of an aspirational sort of argument to that extent. So our objectives for the study were first to understand what types of roles could ASEAN play that would be more of a catalyst for development cooperation. And we explain what we mean by that shortly. Second, if we look at development cooperation through the lens of ASEAN Centrality, is there, the objective there was to understand it through that lens, and then what would it mean for ASEAN to play a more significant, robust role on development. And then third is really an effort to try to help the international community, international NGOs, think tanks, private contractors, and others working in Southeast Asia on development to try to improve understanding and engagement with that community and with ASEAN. This has been a one-year research project. We tried to pull together a really experienced team of people. Kun Apichai, as John mentioned, has worked for many decades, both within the ASEAN Secretariat and various other capacities. We also had another former ASEAN Secretariat senior researcher on the team, Larry Maramis, who's based in Jakarta. And so we had a really good team on this. We were also very privileged to have a great deal of cooperation from the Thai government. Now, Thailand next year, as many of you know, will be the ASEAN chair. And Thailand has already made it fairly clear that sustainable development will be a key theme for their year as ASEAN chair. And they have a lot of ideas on what they're going to try to do with the year. And in many ways, this was an effort to try to inform that process, their planning and their thinking. But we see it as a real opportunity next year. And so that's one reason why the timing of this study happened right now. But I should emphasize this is an independent study, and that this was funded entirely by the Asia Foundation, so with no formal association with ASEAN. Okay. So our study begins with a core observation, which is basically that development, regional development initiatives in Southeast Asia are becoming, in many ways, shaped and colored by increasing geopolitical competition in the region. We've seen, obviously, a number of both expansion of existing regional development initiatives and as well many new ones, many at various stages of development. But of course, the most prominent one is China's Belt and Road Initiative. When we see this, of course, as part of a wider trend of growing geopolitical competition in Southeast Asia. We see, of course, the growing tensions between the United States and China. Australia, Japan, India, and the United States coming together around the Quad and the Indo-Pacific strategy. So there's all of the ASEAN member states, of course, are watching this and are thinking about what all of this means for ASEAN. And as part of that, we've seen a pretty rapid expansion of large infrastructure-related regional schemes for development. Now, in many ways, there's a number of people have argued that this is putting new or increased pressure on ASEAN centrality. Now, what we mean by ASEAN centrality is basically that ASEAN is the main or the primary regional architecture in Southeast Asia, the main vehicle for countries to work together to address shared challenges, and the main apparatus for those countries to engage with the rest of the world, right? And the basic idea is that as countries come into Southeast Asia to engage with those countries, that they should not be setting up new mechanisms, but they should be working through ASEAN. Okay. Now these various regional development initiatives that are happening in the region, we have a list of them in the report. There's, I think, about 15 or 18 of them, depending on how you count them. These are in many ways, major opportunities, but also major risks for the region. Clearly, there's a massive infrastructure need in the region, which is growing dramatically. We found out through the course of the study that from 1967, when ASEAN was first founded, until today, the average income per capita has grown 33 times during that period of time, which is one of the fastest, if not the fastest in the world, from around $120 to just over $4,000 today. And so, of course, the infrastructure hasn't kept up. So there is a massive need for infrastructure development in the region. And a lot of the traditional donors, including the United States, have not been focused on infrastructure for a very long time. And so that need was going largely unmet. But as we've all seen in the news and read, that there are significant risks as well associated with some of these large-scale infrastructure programs. We've seen expanding debt levels, which have become particularly a problem in Sri Lanka and in parts of the Pacific. We also see, in many ways, the expansion of some of these programs without much focus or standards in place around environment or social safeguards, which you might see in some of the more traditional donors. And as well that, as countries become more indebted to particular donors, that there's a chance that they would have a bit more, leverage, or it changes the power dynamics with those countries. So we're basically arguing in this study that we're not making a value judgment on whether this new development is good or bad. We think it actually could be very good if it is managed in a proper way. But that we need to understand it through the lens of ASEAN centrality, and that we need to basically reshape the definition of ASEAN centrality to include development. So the basic idea there is that ASEAN member states should be shaping that development in ways that are win-win for those countries. So, since ASEAN is not playing a major role right now in development, of course, it's required then for us to make the argument for why that should be the case. For those of you who know ASEAN right now, there really is not a comparable, if you look, for example, at the East Asia Summit, a platform where countries from around the world come together to talk about security and political relations in East Asia. There's nothing even close to that for development through ASEAN right now. ASEAN, we'll tell you a little bit more about this in a second. ASEAN does play a role in development, but it's mostly in very narrow, specific areas. It's often led by, for example, a single sectoral body or a single center. So we're making the argument that it should do a lot more and that it should sort of raise up to a more strategic level. There's four basic arguments that we're trying to make for that. The first I've already covered, which is that development is becoming geopolitical. And when aid is purely focused on development or more altruistic things, then that's more traditional methods of managing bilaterally make more sense. But when aid is becoming more geopolitical, there's a much stronger case that smaller and medium-sized countries should be coming together and acting collectively as they engage with some of those aid-providing countries. The second is that ASEAN fundamentally is a development success story. Southeast Asia is a development success story. As I mentioned before, it's grown over 33 times over the last 50 years. Governments in the region, for the most part, have the experience, the capacity, and the assets to shape development assistance in very effective ways. They have large teams, very capable people that are thinking and engaging on development assistance in many cases for decades already. And in number three as well, half of ASEAN member states today are donor nations themselves. So recently Indonesia set up a donor agency. Thailand, Singapore, Brunei, and Malaysia also provide aid to neighboring countries. Thailand provides aid to Africa and many other countries as well. So it's not huge amounts of money, but nonetheless, they have agencies set up that think about development policy, and they're going out to provide aid to third countries. And so that really, in many ways, changes the nature of development assistance in that region. And then finally, ASEAN and the Southeast Asia region is quite a distinctive area for development. It has the full spectrum of countries from low income to high income. It also has a number of challenges which are somewhat distinctive. So for example, several countries in the region are addressing or facing middle income trap types of challenges, Thailand and Malaysia in particular. Other countries are moving in that direction fairly quickly. And there's a number of issues. Thailand, for example, is facing aging society. These are not the kind of problems that a typical aid recipient regions face, either low income or fragile states. There's a very, very different context. And so for all of these reasons, we're making the case that we should look at development cooperation in Southeast Asia differently, and that the countries in that region should play a much more significant joined up role. Okay. Now, Apichai is going to walk us through the tricky question of how that might work, some of the constraints and challenges to that, and how ASEAN is already playing this role.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's good to be back. The last time I was here in Washington was 29 years ago. So somebody was asking me, has it changed? I said, I haven't seen much. I arrived only at midnight. It's in the dark. All I saw is, okay, Lincoln Memorial, the usual landmarks are still there. Okay, so maybe that's the good story. Anyway, okay, talking about ASEAN being a catalyst. Catalyst can mean different things to different people, but this is how we considered it in this current study or context. Yeah, we just on these four different criteria. I think one of the key things that if you are a catalyst is probably in this context is that you are a platform for dialogue and discussions. And I mean, what Tom has mentioned, for example, in the political security realm of ASEAN, you already have, right? East Asia Summit, ARF, ASEAN Regional Forum, and the like, okay? A platform where they bring all the various key actors into the discussion. But again, as I said, in the development sphere, we haven't seen this very prominently yet, okay? And that's why we want to see how we can perhaps encourage those steps to be taken. I think the second is probably self-evident, it's an information and monitoring clearinghouse, which actually ASEAN does have a sort of what we call an ASEAN Statistical Systems Committee. And the ASEAN also produces yearbooks, yeah, just like many other organizations do. And by and large, most of it are economic, obviously, because AEC, yeah, the ASEAN Economic Committee, is the main sort of driving force there. But increasingly, like more social, and cultural indicators are also being put in. Less so perhaps in the political, because sometimes how do you measure, or sometimes it's, you get into many different, shall we say, sensitive issues there. So in other words, economic by and large, very little in the middle on social, cultural, and then practically non-existent on the political. But I think ASEAN is working towards, they're actually putting in place ASEAN has these 3 pillars, right? The political, economic, and social, and each are now mandated to monitor and evaluate their own pillars. So I think they're putting in place now systems to actually collect data, how to assess, and then how to evaluate whether they are successful or not, okay? So it's work in progress, all right? Then the third one is more on, okay, how to what extent ASEAN is a collection of 10 member states, right? So to what extent ASEAN policies get adopted by national governments. I think that's the main challenge right now, whether it's AEC or any other cultural, any other pillar. Even in AEC, where it's supposed to be the most advanced in terms of progress, still, I mean, the only thing ASEAN can claim that, okay, the tariffs have come down, basically more or less close to 0. And that's probably the only thing that ASEAN can legitimately claim. On services, on investment, other things, they haven't met their targets yet at all. Okay, so that's again another still in work in progress. All right, and then finally, to have some mechanisms that would shape external policy, like what Tom has mentioned. I think you can see it most prominently in the political and the economic side, less so on the so-called development or social side. But then ASEAN actually has a full range of entities. I mean, of course, it has a secretariat, just like the UN has a secretariat. But then it also has various different centers, which we will touch on a little bit later. It also has a whole suite of sectoral bodies from A to Z. Yeah, sometimes it's called an alphabet soup. You have any ASEAN documents like this one too, you have to have a list of all the acronyms so that you can know what is what. All right, and then of course it also has a whole range of networks. So the next slide, just to illustrate, this is an illustrative one, by no means all exhaustive, just to see against those 4 criteria which I just mentioned, what are some of the ASEAN centers or action plans or initiatives or whatever, or sectoral bodies, and how do they match up against those 4 criteria, okay? Now you can see I've circled 2, I just said as an example. The AHA Center, okay, AHA, okay, what's that? That means it's the ASEAN Coordinating Center for Humanitarian Assistance on Disaster Management, okay? Basically, when you have a natural disaster, how do you go and respond? Of course, these are basically national government responsibilities by and large. But then ASEAN say, well, there's a lot of disaster happening in our region, right? Every year, sometimes every month even. So how do we, collectively as a region, also need to respond and add value to that? So the AHA Center was set up for that purpose, to provide a more coordinated response from the whole ASEAN region, okay? And so what they have now is their slogan is one ASEAN, one response. I mean, of course, that's the ideal, yeah? Trying to reach that kind of, it's quite a challenging one. But I think AHA does provide a good sort of, shall we say, template for which to, if ASEAN really wants to move into the more development sphere effectively and in a timely manner, then AHA is a good case example. I think basically, at least we feel that they have met at least practically all of the 4 criteria. I think one of the key is that they did have very good leadership. It's usually headed by the executive director. Of course, it's still under the ASEAN umbrella, yeah? So they cannot go beyond the non-interference and the usual consensus principles of ASEAN. But with effective leadership and also with their active engagement with various parties in the disaster management scheme, whether it's the Red Cross or the UN OCHA or even private, and other entities, they managed to at least galvanize a certain degree of collective response, okay? By no means perfect, still glass half full, but then at least I think we can show something. And I think this is one clear example. The other one is what we call MPAC, is actually the master plan for ASEAN connectivity. I think has been mentioned earlier that connectivity is becoming very key. And ASEAN itself also has this master plan. I think this is already the 2nd phase. There's already one early on, and then now the next one will take to 2025 in line with the ASEAN vision. Now, what this master plan does is, okay, they define it, connectivity, again, it can mean different things, but they have included 3 main things. One is the physical connectivity, yeah, the railroads, the highways, the ports or whatever. And then the second is the institutional connectivity among the different bodies or agencies that need to come into play, yeah, the transport ministries, yeah, or the the utilities or whatever, okay. And then the final one is the people-to-people connectivity. In other words, ASEAN is a collection of 650 million people. How do we make sure that they also benefit and how they should engage in, determining where the connectivity should be? Okay, so that is the overall picture of that. Now, in the case of MPAC, I think again this is our own sort of team judgment. We can debate and argue about it, but at least we feel that they have actively achieved two: information clearinghouse. They have probably succeeded quite well. Mechanism to shape external. They also managed to bring in donors like World Bank, ADB, or even the Chinese or any other donors who are working on infrastructure connectivity issue. Maybe slightly less so on the others. Okay. Again, you can go through this analysis, and then more details are in the report. Okay. Then the other case study what we did was we did 4 case studies, and then we are going to show this one just as an example, because we think that the human trafficking case in ASEAN, as you all know, human trafficking is a worldwide problem. At the UN global level, they have the UN protocols and the convention. Now, ASEAN also has its own protocol since 2007 when it's finally ratified, which is called the ASEAN Convention on Trafficking in Persons, all right, especially for women and children, which is now in force. Okay, so ASEAN does have a legally binding instrument in place on human trafficking, and then it has developed what is called the BOHO action plan, which is the plan of action to implement that. Okay, so I think as far as processes go, ASEAN does have them. And what is unique about this is that it's actually a very cross-sectoral plan, all right? Because, if you look at human trafficking, it is also a security issue, yeah? Human security issue. And then it also touches on transnational crime, right? Money laundering, all the stuff, that deals with human trafficking, and also with criminal justice, prosecution, and so forth. So that is more or less under the political security pillar. And it's also a social cultural problem, right, or challenge. What do you do with victims that are being trafficked? How do you rehabilitate them? How do you repatriate them? Yeah? How do you make sure that they are properly taken care of? So therefore, you see all these acronyms on this second bar column. Don't worry about them, but just to say that there are about a dozen different ASEAN bodies somehow involved in trafficking, okay, including on money laundering issues and so forth. Okay, so it's a whole bunch of things. And then towards the right-hand side, you have the more sub-regional and the other players. So a whole host of players involved, from NGOs to government agencies to international organizations and so forth. So it can be quite challenging and complex. How do you then coordinate across sectors, across different institutional boundaries, across nations and so forth? But at least it's a good start, all right? And we always have to start somewhere. As the saying goes, a journey of 1,000 miles start with the first step, right? So at least ASEAN has, to our mind, start the first step, okay? As to how far they can go, only time will tell, and depends on political will and other things, okay? Can we go on? Yeah. Okay, but then we also need, I think Tom has touched upon, ASEAN is also a creature which has its own unique, features and characteristics. I mean, we cannot expect ASEAN to solve all the problems, even though we would like them to. And of course, they get bashed for it, yeah, especially from the NGOs and the media. But if you understand what this creature can or cannot do, this is what we are trying to say. Basically, ASEAN, because of the consensus nature, sometimes is very slow and very not so responsive. So therefore, naturally, by default, you don't come out very quickly, yeah, something like that. Okay, you don't expect ASEAN to come and out to be the champion very easily, because it requires all 10 member states to agree first. All right, and then also to get consensus on these can be also a challenge. And even on sometimes non-sensitive issues, it takes months, or weeks or months in order to get agreement on. And then of course, if you work across sector, like on human trafficking, or even on on connectivity, it's also cross-sector in many ways. It becomes very challenging and complex because you're not dealing with just one country but 10, and sometimes with external partners too. All right. And finally, the secretariat itself. Even though, when I first started secretariat 25 years ago, we only have 25 professional staff. How can you do, the work? Of course, the agenda is quite different then. That time, the agenda is much more, shall we say, less cumbersome, less extensive. So yeah, we manage, okay? But now, you look at all the, sectoral bodies, all the issues. So even 300 is understaffed, quite stretched, okay? And they travel all the time. So I guess that's another critical obstacle. Okay, finally, as far as my slide, when you engage the wider world, as Tom was saying, in terms of ODA now, we are tracking, ODA, right? Official Development Assistance, which the OECD countries, meaning the main donors of the industrial countries, give aid to the developing countries. And here we are tracking from the OECD data how much Southeast Asia as a region gets, all right, each year, okay? And when we divide it into 3 different categories, those that actually are channeled directly through ASEAN, because we want to see how much ASEAN share is, how much directly goes through ASEAN processes, mechanisms, and so forth, as ASEAN endorsement, basically, yeah? That is indicated by the blue line, yeah? Okay? There's a sudden peak somehow in about 2008, but otherwise it's actually more or less below the rest, okay? And then the second category is there are many organizations that work with ASEAN, but they do not channel it through ASEAN, no? They still manage it themselves, but they partner with ASEAN or shake hands with ASEAN on certain related areas, okay? And that's indicated by the red line, so collaboration with ASEAN, okay? But the money is being managed and withheld by the donor or whatever institute they set up. And then finally, the third is areas that Southeast Asia receive, which has nothing to do with ASEAN, as far as we can tell, all right? So basically, the ASEAN share, the average, this is a track over a 14-year time frame from 2000 to 2010 where we get the data. ASEAN share is only about 19%. Not very big, right? I mean, just like intra-ASEAN trade, is about 25%, hovering 25%. The EU has a much higher, right, to 75% as far as we can tell. So that shows the gap, the potential gap. If ASEAN wants to, let's say on inter-ASEAN trade, want to move higher to more integrated, then that should move up over time. What we are saying here is also the development ODA gap, that there's out of 100%, you only are getting 20% at most. Okay, so one thing is strategies, if ASEAN wishes, then they can try to draw in, through whatever means. Okay, how about, why don't we do together through ASEAN? Okay, but then you have to prove yourself that you are worthy of their trust and investment. Okay, but on the other hand, ASEAN may not necessarily want to do all of it. In other words, to put everything in ASEAN baskets is also not the best of many worlds, right? Because donors also have their own agenda, their own interests. They don't want to put everything in one basket, right? So they want to spread it around for whatever purpose. But what we are trying to argue here is that maybe ASEAN, even those that are not directly with ASEAN, how can ASEAN shape, or shall we say, make sure that the other donor, the other 80%, that or whatever percent that is outside ASEAN, can be aligned with ASEAN objectives and plans. I mean, ASEAN has a Vision 2025. They have every sector has a plans. So if there are a way for ASEAN to be a catalyst, is to align all the other players to align more or less to the ASEAN policies and plans. Okay, I think Tom would continue. Yeah.
Great, thanks, Apichai. Just to clarify as well, so this data is only regional development programs. This is not bilateral, right? So that's why the numbers look relatively small. Okay, and I think an important also point to make is that we're not arguing to put more money through ASEAN, right, for development. What we're basically arguing is that ASEAN should actually play a more strategic role, not trying to actually manage projects, but actually sort of more playing a role of shaping programs more broadly. And part of that is that ASEAN, we think there's an important opportunity for ASEAN to really be more at the center of development dialogue and development and multi-sectoral sort of debates about the future of development in the region. So for ASEAN to play a leadership role in shaping development, it really needs to be more accessible. There's got to be ways that it can be at the center of multi-stakeholder dialogue in ways that it is not right now. So there's a couple parts of that. One is the point I just mentioned, which is that one of our core recommendations is that ASEAN should be thinking of its role in development as much more akin to, say, the OECD Development Assistance Committee, a sort of high-level body that sort of shapes or creates norms or frameworks that then the vast range of other organizations and donors working on development can follow or can sort of buy into, or sort of, you know, and that can in effect shape what everybody else does, right? The ASEAN Secretariat is not going to have the capacity to do a lot more development projects on their own, simply because there are constraints to the number of people they have, et cetera. So, you know, our core argument is that they should sort of think about their role more in terms of, say, the East Asia Summit, which is much more of a platform for coordination and shaping norms. There are as well, I think, important to recognize, which I know many of you who've probably tried to engage with ASEAN would be aware of, which is that there are challenges for how NGOs and non-government actors can engage with ASEAN. There are fundamental challenges. Keep in mind that ASEAN is a government-to-government platform. That's its main function, right? ASEAN has something like 1,500 meetings a year that they have to organize. And that's because it's every part of every ASEAN government talking to its counterparts in every other ASEAN government all the time, right? So it's, you know, the Department of, you know, immigration, it's the education people, it's the, you know, it's the whole range of governments talking to their counterparts. And so within that, of course, sometimes, first of all, it's hard to find time on the calendar, and it's hard to find a way as well for NGOs to sort of fit into that. Also, there's often some disconnects with how ASEAN is approached. For example, a lot of donors and development actors will have a particular agenda that they want to talk about with ASEAN, right? So they'll try to approach the Secretariat. And if they get a meeting, then, you know, they'll say, look, we think Southeast Asia, ASEAN should do more on this, right? Now, the problem is that that's not really how ASEAN works, right? First of all, the Secretariat is not empowered to make policy or to set agendas, et cetera. That comes from the member states, right? So if you get a member state to get behind you on a particular issue, then they might take it to the relevant ASEAN sort of forums, but it's, you know, it's a different kind of approach. In addition, there's a natural sense that, you know, ASEAN is setting an agenda which is shaped by the governments in the region, and that outside actors should support that agenda, right? That's fundamentally sort of how they see development, right? How can others sort of help us accomplish our goals? So there's somewhat of a disconnect if we as outside actors are coming in saying, you know, ASEAN really needs to do more on this. Well, it's not going to go very far in most cases, for example. In addition, you know, ASEAN's DNA is, I'm sure as you've all heard about, consensus-based and non-interference, right? This means that any issue or any project or even meeting a particular organization, if any ASEAN member state has an objection, it's not going to happen, right? And that's how ASEAN works, right? So that makes it hard for many INGOs to go and talk directly to ASEAN because, you know, in many cases, there might be a sensitivity with a particular government that might make it more difficult. And we see in Southeast Asia a broad spectrum of governments and how the extent to which they engage with civil society, right? You have some that engage with them all the time, right? Bring them into government, you know, all the time. And then you have others that are very arm's length or suspicious of civil society. And of course, all of them have to agree. So our main argument is that you've got to be realistic about what can be achieved. There's no way ASEAN can meet everybody, but what is necessary is to find some kind of platform which allows ASEAN to be at a strategic level, at the center of that dialogue, in a way that's realistic and fits with ASEAN's sort of core DNA. And I think fundamentally in this as well, that there are a lot of things that development actors that we should keep in mind when we try to work with ASEAN or approach ASEAN. In many ways, it's about meeting ASEAN halfway. Several years ago, we were doing a study on conflict, subnational conflict, which John mentioned that I led, called the Contested Corners of Asia. And at the time, the ASEAN Secretary General was a trustee of ours, Surin Pitsuwan, who sadly recently passed away. And we asked him whether we should try to work through ASEAN to present the study, to sort of socialize some of the findings, to engage. And his advice was, it's probably not a great idea. It probably won't go very far. And that was largely because, certainly at that time, but even today, issues around subnational conflict are very sensitive for certain governments, right? And so it's hard to imagine that every government would be on board. He was sort of thinking, well, even if you framed it in such a way that would be as close to as acceptable as possible, it would dilute it so much that you couldn't really say much. So we said, look, just probably not a great idea, right? So that's one example of it's not that ASEAN can work on all issues, right? But there are several cases where NGOs, development actors, and others have really, really made a lot of headway and have become very close partners with ASEAN. One example that we mention in the report is a sort of a regional network called ASIADRA, which is basically a network of civil society groups working on rural development, which has become such a close partner of the relevant ASEAN sectoral body, SAMSWAT, SOMADP, sorry, that it actually has helped to draft their regional work plan and their strategy. So it's a good example of how an NGO that was completely outside in the past has managed to really become a quite close partner of ASEAN. Generally, we make the case that we all need to sort of understand and respect ASEAN's mandate, its culture, and its processes if we're going to be more effective at engaging with them. And we can't seek shortcuts or exceptions, right? So in the process just of this study, we really had a good lesson in how that works, right? So trying to engage with the ASEAN Secretariat, who are you representing, why are you here, right? Are you going to say that this is endorsed by ASEAN? No, we're not going to do that, right? We had to sort of explain who we are, and we had to kind of go through a process which was legitimate for them. And in the end, it was fine. They spent a lot of time with us. We had a great deal of interaction with the Secretary General and with all the different pillars. But we had to take it slow and go through that process in a way that made sense for them. Okay, and then the final point, I mentioned this to some extent before, as development actors, we often have an issue or sort of an agenda that we want to pursue. And so to understand the difference between approaching either with an existing project, right, and looking for buy-in, right, from ASEAN is often not going to go very well, right? Whereas if you come and say, we know that ASEAN, well, we looked at your work plan, we know your agenda, we know that we have shared interest on this, can we work together on that? That's a totally different approach, right? And that tends to work much, much better. Okay, now finally, we have 8 quick recommendations we can go through and then quickly move to Q&A. First, as we said from the very beginning, we're making the case that ASEAN Centrality should include regional development cooperation. And so ASEAN already has the architecture and the mechanisms in political security and in economic cooperation, but it hasn't done this so far in development. And we're saying that it really should be included in that. Second, that given ASEAN's success in development, given its experience and its government's competency in development cooperation already, that it really makes sense to have an ASEAN framework for development, which sort of builds on the principles and values and experience of the region. Third is a lot of our data actually pointed to a future where increasingly development to Southeast Asia is going to be more and more regional. Now, it's still, the vast majority is still bilateral, right? So make no mistake, it's less than 5% is regional assistance. But we found in our discussions with donors and dialogue partners and sectoral dialogue partners, some of the smaller donors are ending their bilateral programs and putting all of their money into the region, into regional programs, largely because they say, look, the region is developing, right? So we want to stay engaged, but we're not going to do that on a bilateral basis. So there's a lot of evidence pointing to that, although it's early stage. And so therefore, we're arguing that ASEAN should be prepared for that and to sort of get ahead of the curve on that. Fourth, and this in many ways is our central point, is that ASEAN should be shaping regional development assistance, but it can't do it by trying to manage or be involved in every single project and every single actor, et cetera. That it should raise its level to be much more at the strategic level where it's going to work better for everyone. Fifth, there's a lot that can be done to enhance ASEAN's current structures to be more proactive, more cross-sectoral, and more externally oriented. The report has a number of recommendations on how that can be done. I won't go through them right now. This is more sort of internal ASEAN stuff, but there's a lot that can be done there. Six, that ASEAN ideally would prioritize more engaging with the wider world of development actors. Within the confines of consensus and non-interference, we think there's a lot more that can be done there, and we have a few suggestions. Seventh, Thailand is planning to set up a center next year called the ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Study and Dialogue. And we think that there's a good argument for this. There's a lot of good examples like the AHA Center, where if ASEAN wants to really play a leadership role on a certain set of issues, it'll set up autonomous capacity to be able to do that because of the challenges of working within the primary structures. So we think that there's a good argument for this, what Thailand's doing, and we have a number of suggestions about what that center might do. And then lastly, we have a few recommendations sub-recommendations within this, just on ASEAN's potential role on emerging technologies and helping the region prepare for the future of development in light of technological change. One of our case studies is on high-skilled labor, particularly technology-savvy labor workforce, and the challenges of that right now within the region, and some suggestions on what more ASEAN can do on that. Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom and Kun Apichai. We have about 40 minutes left for questions and discussion. If you would kindly raise your hand, we'll have a microphone, so please wait for that. State your name, your institutional affiliation, and your question and who you're directing it to. So the floor is open. Answered all the questions.
Hi, this is Kyle Lamarji with the International Foundation for Electoral Systems. My question could be directed to either one of the speakers. I'll direct it to Apichai. I was wondering how you see the initiative for ASEAN integration fitting into this picture. It seems to me like this is maybe the beginnings of a regional development strategy, and I was curious. I don't know a lot about it myself, but I see it's thematically related to what you guys are trying to propose here.
Yeah, thank you. This initiative for ASEAN integration, this is an ASEAN-initiated scheme back in 2000. Yeah, I think it was Singapore at that time. Prime Minister Goh Chok Tong was the one who initiated it at one of the summits, and this took place just right after all Southeast Asian members became, the CLMV all became members, right? Because Cambodia was the last one that came in 1999. And of course, these are the new members are relatively more poorer, less developed, and therefore the idea was that the richer and the older ones should help them. I mean, much just like what the EU has done. Yeah, when they took on the new member states, when the communist Cold War, was over, and then all the eastern states joined EU, but they were the levels of development was quite different, and therefore, but EU fortunately has more money and authority, and that's the main difference, right? European Commission can, authorize social fund, whatever fund they have to help those needy countries, and then they can, make sure that the mandates stick. Okay, ASEAN, on the other hand, is still very much member-centric, and therefore, and then with all these different diversities and things, you can never really get to that level, okay? But this was an attempt actually by ASEAN 6 to help the ASEAN 4, basically, all right? And so this has been running for the last 18 years and is now into the third phase, yeah? They run into different phases, okay? Now, of course, and then the new countries are basically within the mainland Southeast Asia, right? Cambodia, Laos, Myanmar, and Vietnam. So we have, by the way, I don't know, we only have limited copies of the report, right? Yeah, we have a few copies if you're interested, because we did another case study. Remember, we have 4 case studies, and one of it is on sub-regional development. Is what I did, I actually map it out on Mekong, because this is basically a Mekong, focus centric scheme, right? But right now, I have mapped out at least 12 intergovernmental frameworks in the Mekong. You have, the Mekong River Commission, which is a more water-related one, which is the longest, already 60 or more years old. And then I think in the early 1990s, when finally, war came to an end in Indochina, there's peace, then the ADB, started what they call the Greater Mekong Sub-Regional, GMS, okay? So this has run for about 25 years now. And then from an ASEAN, of course, I came in 2000, and then from late 2005 onwards, there's a whole series of new Mekong projects from the various different development donors or even powers. You have the US has a Lower Mekong initiative, right? Japan also has one, Korea has one, India has one, now China also wants to have one. So that's already about 5 or 6, and then plus the other area run, and then you have all these sub configuration like CLMV or CLV, or you have all the permutations there. So it's getting to be a very crowded space, but again, lack of coordination and integration, you know what I mean? Each is doing their little stuff, things, and there's no sort of a overarching, overall snapshot of what's going on. I mean, ADB, I think, tried once, but I haven't heard of it since, so I don't know what's the status now, okay? But it's not, it's not difficult if all the donors agree that, okay, we will share certain basic information about what we do, okay? This is what I think OECD DAC is, right, in a way, trying to do on the donor side to the global aid. So I guess we are arguing that maybe there should be some kind of overall coordinator of sorts, or maybe if you're compared to an orchestra that is a conductor. Right now, each is playing their own tune. And so it becomes very dissonant and not harmonized, right? So what you need is to be a bit more aligned, more things. And since Mekong, at least 5 of the Mekong countries are ASEAN states anyway, right? Including Thailand. So I think what we are trying to suggest is that half of your member states are in this now very contested area and very uncoordinated. So why don't you come in and provide some overarching kind of set the overall norms or rules of the game? Of course, you don't have to go into the finer detail. Each has their own thing, and they each have their own agenda and things. But at least to say, all right, all these are working towards an overall direction. Right now, it's all going all sorts of different directions, okay? So what we are trying to say is provide some kind of complementarity or cohesion of some sort, okay? And so you will find that under, let's say, on page 46, this table that I have, mapped out. And so in the end, the argument is to play a catalytic role, then ASEAN should step up its role, okay? And in fact, it has already set up one mechanism back in 1996. I don't know, many people may not know, but I know because I was there and when it was born. So it's called the ASEAN Mekong Basin Development Cooperation, AMBDC, and it's also in my list, okay? And the whole idea at that time was, mind you, 1996, there was only 7 ASEAN countries at that time, right? Vietnam has joined, but Cambodia, Laos, and Myanmar are still outside ASEAN. But they already include, the ASEAN AMBDC actually is 10 plus 1. That means all of the Southeast Asian countries plus China. So they were, actually that was a very forward-looking move on the part of ASEAN. They were already anticipating that the remaining 3 countries will eventually, sooner or later, come into the fold, and China is going to be a very important player in the Mekong, okay? And the overall principles and things you can go out and look, it's quite broad, generally, of course, economic driven, because that's the need of the Mekong at that time. But they also mentioned about other things about natural resources, and also the need to draw in international collaborators and donors, World Bank, UN, what you name it. All right, so it's quite open. But unfortunately, what happened was, since the focus was economic, then they gave it to the economic ministers and officials. But somehow along the way, it got off track. And the only thing, the flagship that they talk about over the years under AMBDC is the Singapore Kunming Railway. Anybody heard about that? Of course, it's nice. It's a connectivity project to build a railway from Kunming, southern China, which is in the Mekong, down to Singapore. Actually, the Singapore to Nong Khai stretch, is already there for ages, right? Of course, it needs to be upgraded. But the thing is, ASEAN doesn't have money, so it goes to ADB and others. ADB, of course, through GMS, does a little bit of the missing links and that, but this project has never even materialized fully at this point. But now China is building the railway down, right? From Yunnan down to Laos, and eventually, once it reaches Nong Khai in Thailand, then you can connect up to the rest. The rest is already done, okay? Okay, at least that's one rail line, okay? So what we are saying is that now some other players are now making the Singapore Kunming Railway to be a reality, okay? And unfortunately, because of that, this body went into some sort of limbo. It hasn't met for the last 4 years, as far as we know. And then I asked, is it still dead or alive? No, it's not, neither dead or alive. It's one of those coma or whatever. But then I said, let's revive it, If there's a way to revive it, this is the time to do it, And this is also in the report. So read our report. Does that answer your question, so to speak? Yeah, thank you.
Well, I think this example is just one example of how they jumped in, tried to do a project, right? It didn't go very well, right? And so if they're going to do it again, they need to think about their level at a higher level. Yeah. Not for IAI, that's for the specific one he was just talking about.
Anyone else?
My name is Will Noland, currently unaffiliated, but once upon a time a colleague of Apichai's. I appreciate the report just came out yesterday, I guess, and I must say, having skimmed through parts of it, that it seems comprehensive and helpful to those who are interested. And I guess I would just ask if you could put it into the context, perhaps, of efforts within ASEAN itself to think through its own future, and how you anticipate or hope that this might be, if you will, inserted into the thinking of those who are thinking about the future and trying to change and develop ASEAN.
Yeah, thank you, Will. I think we talked a little bit over lunch already, but anyway, I will elaborate on it now. I mean, like the whole thrust of this study is to say that, look, maybe development cooperation should take on a higher profile within ASEAN, okay? Basically, and I think we have argued quite strongly, and if the ASEAN member states agree and they can take it up, that will be all in good. And I think development cooperation is an area where, by and large, it's probably the least sensitive of all issues, right, among the 3 different areas, all right? I mean, nobody can argue against we need to do something on poverty, for example, or inequality, right? Everybody has signed up to SDGs, Whereas if you talk about Rakhine, you talk about AEC, sometimes there's sensitive issue, more sensitive there. I mean, not to say there's no sensitivity, but there is, but comparatively, I think it's less. So therefore, it should be more easier to step in and increase your strategic, sort of planning and leverage that way. And then I think more importantly now, as I can tell you that now with, BRI is basically a development, oriented kind of activity, although it has other implications. But they're using development as the key or the tool, right, to open doors, right? I mean, so are the others, like in the Mekong, for example. These are all development-related projects, although with strategic things in mind, right? but development is the spear or the spearhead. And then I think then we need to maybe go back to why was ASEAN started in the first place, back in 51 years ago? Wasn't it also due to geopolitical contestation in the Mekong, shall we say, broader region, right? Of course, more ideological perhaps at that time. But here we're having a similar kind of contestation, maybe less ideological, maybe more economic or whatever, but nevertheless, it's a contestation. So if ASEAN wants to still maintain its centrality, or even its survival, then I don't think it should neglect this. And therefore, we are saying that development cooperation should be the tool, one of the tools for them to up their ante, shall we say, okay? I mean, ASEAN is always say, well, we want to be friends with everybody. Oh, sure, that's fine, okay? I mean, you can still do that within the realm of art. And I think even now with BI or Indo-Pacific, everybody is also trying to court ASEAN, right? Because it's in the middle. Without ASEAN, then you don't have as strong as either strategy in both camps. So ASEAN is still very crucial in that sense. And therefore, we thought this is a good opportunity and timing. And I think Thailand would, in the chairmanship next year, either through the new Sustainable Development Study Center or other means, would probably have more to say and do on this regard. I would hope so.
Yeah, I mean, I would just emphasize that Thailand does seem to have big plans in this area. The one, I think, factor that is potentially going to be a challenge is that most of the governments in ASEAN prefer to handle development through bilateral channels. And there's as well a little bit of a conflict between different parts of government where the development planning agencies and those who are kind of the, like the Bappenas in Indonesia and other places, they are very powerful ministries, right? And they would prefer to handle exclusively development, right? Whereas the foreign ministries, which tend to lead on ASEAN, tend to, lose that argument usually, right? But what we're saying now is that that's changed quite a bit. Like in a place like Thailand, which now has a development agency giving money out, which sits in the foreign ministry, that really changes the nature of development cooperation. So our thinking is that with Thailand's leadership, the profile and the concerns, I think there's a lot of anxiety about Belt and Road in Southeast Asia, a lot. And I think this partly may be an idea whose time has come, but there's going to be some challenges for sure.
Thank you. I'm Eddie Lachika. I'm a retired journalist. I'd like to call your attention to the Thailand-Laos leg of the Pan-Asia Railway and see whether the initiatives that you suggest can ameliorate the problems that they're having. First of all, the Thailand leg was initiated by Prayut in 2013. But in 2016, 2 years later, Thailand sort of like wanted to give it up because the terms were very onerous to Thailand. But the same year, Prayut was pressured in the 2016 G20 summit by the Chinese to restore the project because the Chinese were desperate to get the project back on track. I think the same thing happened with Laos. Now the question is, was Thailand kind of helpless in this position? Was there any means by which ASEAN could sort of support, help Thailand reshape the project so that it would be to its best advantage? And secondly, is the issue of centrality. I've read some commentary that this Pan-Asia Railway, once it's built, if ever it's built, it's going to cost billions of dollars. It will divide ASEAN in two. In other words, it will not could be conducive to centrality. It will be the opposite. It could sort of leave the maritime nations east of the railway on its own, more or less. They are invested heavily in ports like Indonesia and Malaysia. And whereas the trade would be funneled into China and into the OBOR, into the belt, whatever. So in other words, how will your initiatives kind of ameliorate this potential problems?
Yeah, great questions. First, I don't know the specifics about, tactics used, with a negotiation around the railway. I know there's others here who would know a lot more about that. But you're right in some ways to characterize it. It was started with great fanfare in 2014 and then has kind of slowed down. A lot of that is partly to do with changing dynamics. The Thai government's now become much more connected, but as well internal Thai government bureaucratic challenges in terms of allowing Chinese workers to come into work on it and other things like that. There's a number of explanations for why it's slowed down. But nonetheless, it is an example of one of our arguments, which is that aid that is provided with a geopolitical context between a small or medium-sized country with a much larger country, China being one, but there are others as well, has certain power dynamics that go with it, right? And that if governments get together, Thai, Laos, and others get together and create either a framework or try to set amongst themselves a way that they would like to see collectively programs, being unfolding, then they'll have a lot more leverage if they do it collectively than if they do it individually, right? So it's a good example of the basic point that I think it could actually make a difference. Yeah. Sorry, what was the other question? Oh, that's right, and whether that actually might be split up. I don't know about that because, to be honest, mainland Southeast Asia, frankly, is much, much less connected and developed in terms of infrastructure in many ways than other parts of maritime Southeast Asia. So I don't know to that argument. I would say one thing, which is that there's a study that came out of William and Mary recently that looked at Chinese infrastructure aid and that it actually has had a significant positive impact in addressing inequalities, which just came out a few months ago, which is a fascinating article. And it, in some ways, it makes sense if you think about, part of what they're saying, I think, is that, sort of white elephant projects, which are building infrastructure to nowhere, actually help connect places which don't have connectivity and have actually created significant opportunities for people in remote areas. I think that that's something that should be looked at more closely, and potentially a very positive story. So I don't know about the broader sort of splitting ASEAN in two argument, but I would say that infrastructure is definitely needed in the region, mainland at least.
Hello, Nat Pinoy, consulting with the World Bank. One comment and one question. And the comment is on this infrastructure linkages between the mainland ASEAN. Even though the railway may not be there yet, but I think the road infrastructure is very well established, especially from Thailand eastward, through Laos, go up to China, Laos to Vietnam, and all of these main roads are already there. From Thailand, you can go all the way to Da Nang or to other ports on Vietnam seashore. But on the western side, that's limited because of Myanmar just opened up very recently. But the development in terms of road infrastructure are moving there fairly fast. A lot of foreign donors or MDBs are there to make sure that these connectivities are in place, especially ADB through their GMS operations. My question is on the ASEAN centrality. I think it needs some demand of regional mutual benefit type of project, something that is a flagship that everybody can agree with. You mentioned that there's something nobody would argue against the poverty reduction, for example. One of the key critical problems right now in ASEAN and elsewhere is on this ocean waste. I don't remember exactly the numbers, but collectively ASEAN plus China and Korea and Japan have a lot of waste going down into the Pacific, South China Sea, and even all the way down to Australia, New Zealand. So I think these are something that all ASEAN nations can put their head together and help trying to come up with solution, cleanup, prevention, and mitigation, and so on. I think this is something that if ASEAN can focus on some key issues that would benefit everybody, I think that would make it a success. Thank you.
Yeah, I think, as far as I know, the ASEAN has two committees that look at the marine issues, at least in the social cultural side. One is in the Science Technology Committee on Marine Science, and the other one in the environment side with marine and coastal resources. So, and I think marine debris or ocean debris is being picked up there. Of course, to what extent they can do something? I mean, it will require a collective decision from all, the consensus and things. And I think they have already had several meetings, and I think some donors have also, funded certain activity, including the U.S. and others. So, and it's becoming an important issue now. I think even many countries have started to consider that this to be very important. And therefore, I hope that and you're right. I think several of the ASEAN countries are actually major contributors to this. So, well, maybe World Bank can help.
If you look at the statistics, China is the largest polluter of plastics and microplastics, but numbers 2 through 6 are other Asian countries. 5 of them are ASEAN countries. It's Indonesia, but it is number 2, and then in no particular order, Thailand, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines, and then Sri Lanka. And then the first non-Asian country that is the largest polluter is Egypt. The United States is number 20, but it is the largest polluter of any OECD nation. It's my view that if ASEAN took this issue, I mean, part of it is the sensitivity where Tom getting into the geopolitics of this, because you're now talking about the sensitivity of maritime borders, right? But I think that if ASEAN were to say, let's, within our own backyards, work together to try to do this, and I think this has the potential in helping to develop and strengthen ASEAN Centrality. If they did this amongst themselves and then started to work in concentric circles in terms of saying, let's bring in other Asian nations, and particularly extra-regional powers like China, India, which is also a large polluter, and then you could even bring in Japan. They're not on that list. Well, what are they doing that's successful to do that? In Korea, getting the technology that involved and policies that are involved that could be very helpful in trying to clean up the marine environment. And the U.S. could also play a role saying, yes, we still have a challenge with this, but we have had some success. What did we do that was successful? What do we need to do more? And I think you could really develop a strong sense of regional cooperation around this issue if it has to be handled delicately, but I think it could be successful with a lot of hard work. So, next question? Yes, Mike.
Thank you for a great presentation. I learned a lot. I want to make sure I understood something correctly and then ask for a little more analysis. I understood you, Tom, to say that it seemed like this rail, as it applies to Thailand, has slowed down, I thought you heard me say. And of course, we all have our own little tiny windows on this world. But I just came back from Thailand and came away with the impression that this is actually further along, moving faster than most people, certainly in this town, but in much of the world, realize. And not only the north-south business, but also east-west, the EEC. And I was also in Cambodia, and they're all excited about this. So I guess I just really want to explore, what do you mean slow, or did I just misunderstand?
Well, specifically on that railway, I know that they just broke earth for the Korat to Bangkok portion, right? And so it's moving ahead. I suppose it's, I mean, if you read the news a few years ago, you would have thought that it was already there, right? So, you know, it's funny, I made a bit of a faux pas recently. I was in a car with a deputy Australian ambassador in Khon Kaen, and there's what looks like sort of a SkyTrain sort of elevated something, right, which goes right through downtown Khon Kaen. And I said, oh, that must be the new Chinese railway. And actually, somebody corrected me. No, I don't think it is. So I don't think they've built that portion. I don't think they've even started. So there's a lot of confusion about how far along it is. It's definitely going ahead, but of course the story in Bangkok has been, oh, there's lots of problems with it. Oh, the Engineers Association will never let it happen. Oh, Prayut's he's not, you know, he's not coming down. Why is Prayut backing off? You know, and there's been all kinds of speculation. But at least the attitude in Bangkok has been, it's moving it. The government is committed to it, but there's lots of resistance and seems to be a lot of back and forth about it. So, yeah, that's my impression. Yeah. Right. That's right. High-speed rail. Right. That's right.
I mean, okay, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think many ski. I mean, you know, I think in Thailand, you know that the Chinese rail the Chinese are building this rail from Nong Khai down, right? This high speed, yeah. Whereas the Japanese are building it to Chiang Mai, I think sector, right? That the Japanese are doing that. I think Indonesia also had this combo, right? One line is Japanese and one line Chinese. But you know what I found out at least in Thailand, I asked the engineers, you know, because my concept of the original idea was something like the Euro rail, you know, where you just take one train and you can go all over Europe, right? But apparently that won't work in Thailand because, you know why? It's not that the physical one cannot, but it's the signaling system is different. The Chinese train signaling system and the Japanese signaling completely different. So you cannot run the Chinese train on the Japanese system and vice versa. So I said, oh, so you have to have Japanese carriage running one line and the Chinese on the other one, you know. That seems to be a bit, I mean, this is where I think ASEAN should come in to say, hey, why you have all these different rail lines that connect but don't connect, you know what I mean? Yeah, they connect on the hardware but not connect on the software. So you basically don't have connect.
It's no way to run a railroad.
Maybe America should feel another one, just like you build a railroad to the west.
Thanks very much, Tom and Kun Apichai. Kim McQuay from Asia Foundation. You mentioned in framing your remarks at the beginning sort of the phenomenon of geopolitics and how that's having an impact on the region. And I realize that this is sort of a set of recommendations that are aimed at a variety of different stakeholders. Could you just say a little bit, if those recommendations were to be taken up, could you say a little bit about sort of the spoilers? If there were pockets of resistance to recommendations of that kind, where would they be likely to come from? What they might look like?
Good question. I mean, look, this report is a combination of, you know, sort of some broad observations around geopolitics, all the way down to very policy wonkish, you know, what kind of committees should you work with within ASEAN, right? It tries to be practical and pragmatic about what you can do and talk to the ASEAN audience, but as well try to explain the relevance to a much broader, both political security audience as well, right? I mean, my guess within an ASEAN context is, I mean, you know, there are a couple more developed nations, right, which have been skeptical of ASEAN playing a significant role in development in the past, although some of them have been starting to change their mind. I mean, Singapore is one example, but in their year as chair, they've actually taken on board a lot of the ideas more recently. So there does seem to be a little bit of a change, right, on the Singapore side. I think fundamentally what's likely to happen is, and that's why we were very careful with this report, if these recommendations are seen to be targeting one particular donor country, they're not going to go well, right? And they will not be taken up, right? So we're very careful in this to say, look, there's a whole cacophony of different actors that are providing assistance, often for, they're kind of, yes, there's a little bit of copycat going on, right? And of course, the biggest one is China, right? But, this is a story about how countries, in this region can take greater control of their own destiny if they simply organize themselves to do such. And they've already organized themselves to do that in other areas, right? So there's no reason why they couldn't do it in this area as well. So my guess is the biggest potential spoiler will be those who would say, oh, look, this is just about trying to stop, aid from China because everybody's worried about, China becoming integrated with Southeast Asia, which could potentially come from some of the mainland Southeast Asian countries. So that's why I think certainly Thailand, in our conversations with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Thailand, quite extensive conversations about this, was very careful to say, look, this cannot be about China. This has got to be about Southeast Asia taking control of its own destiny.
Hi, I'm Judy Cochran from SIL International. We focus on, we're a linguistics organization focusing on non-dominant language groups. And my question really is more of a clarification for Tom. You mentioned the proposed ASEAN Center for Sustainable Development Studies and Dialogue. You mentioned that could be opening next year. So has that gone from a proposal to a reality? And is it actually underway? Is there a proposed date? And is it going to be in Bangkok?
As far as I know, it's no. I mean, from what we've learned, they've announced it, haven't they? Yeah.
I mean maybe not.
Right.
There's plans to be announced by the end when Thailand takes over the challenge.
Yeah.
They will certainly.
So we've heard it's going to be based in Bangkok, open in June, and they're trying to figure out the agenda right now. Okay. So it's, for planning purposes, it's likely to happen, right? And the ministry has, or the foreign minister, I think, has referenced something along those lines, although not specific. So I don't want to take their thunder away, right? So, but yeah, it's going to be coming out. Yeah.
Just add a little bit, since I know a little bit more. I think basically, Thailand is within ASEAN now. Thailand is also, since 2016, they have volunteered to be the coordinator of SDGs within ASEAN. Okay? And so therefore, this is part of their, shall we say, manifestation of their role that, okay, why don't we set up this kind of center? Because after all, ASEAN members all sign up to SDG. Of course, SDG by and large has to be implemented nationally, right? All these targets have to be fulfilled by each of these countries. But where ASEAN can add value is to say, all right, maybe we can share the regional experiences from each of these countries. Where are the failures? Where are the successes? Oh, how did you do this? Or maybe I can learn from this. Or don't do that because that goes on around track or something like that. So there's, I think, value in this regional dialogue or platform, shall we say, that we are proposing, and information, clearinghouse or exchanges. I mean, ASEAN has also come up with some. Well, this was the MDGs, That was the previous phase, no? So I presume now they're also tracking SDG, and then later on they would have to monitor and see where the progress is. So I would expect this center should have some role to play in this regard. Not to mention that there are also many similar such centers already set up. I believe there's Jeffrey Sachs centers in Sunway University in Malaysia, I heard, apparently, but I'm not so sure what exactly they do. But they do carry Jeffrey Sachs' name. And then I know that recently, because it was announced that, ESCAP, UN ESCAP, which is the UN Economic Social Commission for Asia Pacific, which is based in Bangkok, they just announced a new executive secretary would be coming in. And I think she's from Indonesia, Professor Amida, who actually now heads an SDG center in Pajajaran University in Bandung. Okay? And she was formerly a Bappenas minister. National Planning Minister. And so I'm sure SDG would be very much on top of her mind. And so I think Thailand, being SDG coordinator ASEAN, and they want to set up a center, there's some things that could dovetail or synergize in this regard. I hope so. Yeah.
We have time for one more question. well. If not, sorry, Gordon.
Gordon Hine, also from the Asia Foundation. It's a bit of a follow-up to Kim's question, although I wouldn't put it in categorize it in terms of spoilers, but in terms of getting more buy-in to the basic concept of an increased important role, coordinating role of centrality of ASEAN in regional development cooperation. Have you had specific conversations with many donors yet, bilateral and multilateral, as to the extent to which they will want to participate and join into this kind of enterprise? Because it will ultimately require their cooperation as well as what's happening on the part of ASEAN and the member states and the ASEAN sectoral bodies. It's going to take multiple people to tango on this. So I'm wondering if you've had any sense so far about the reaction, the willingness of different types of development partners to join in this enterprise and to coordinate more of their own regional activities in cooperation with ASEAN.
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, definitely. This was a key question for us when we met. I think we met about 7 of the dialogue partners. Sectoral. And okay, so there's variance, of course, in terms of level of commitment to ASEAN, right? On the whole, you've got rising commitment to ASEAN by almost all of the dialogue partners, right? I mean, Australia being case in point, right? So they're putting more money into working with ASEAN. They want to do more with ASEAN, right? At the same time, Australia was very clear. They said, look, you can't do everything through ASEAN, right? And there are limits to it. So they're looking at it, through a very realistic and, sort of lens. The other thing, I think, that there's a number of pointers that we tried to pull out, which were, for example, there's a lot of appetite for donors to be able to engage with ASEAN in a way that is outside of the current sort of methods, right? So, for example, a senior U.S. State Department official told us that, they go to these meetings of, which is a rare thing actually, a collective meeting of all the dialogue partners with the IAI project, right? Where ASEAN Secretariat people effectively say, all right, here's the 15 projects. Now who wants to bid for each one, right? And so the donors basically can hold up their hand and say, all right, we'll support that one, et cetera, right? And they don't find it a very meaningful exercise, right? They have no input into the design or priorities. They have no way of engaging with ASEAN in terms of figuring out what they're going to do or et cetera, right? And, it becomes a little bit of a, it becomes a not so helpful exercise, right? So they were saying they would welcome the opportunity to both help shape those things working with ASEAN people in a more sort of back and forth way, and then, to support them later and then to jointly monitor them, right? So there's a lot of appetite, I think, to engage in some areas, right? But there's also, I think, some, they're also being very clear that they're not asking ASEAN to take on a lot of new mandate or role, not mandate, but more sort of hands-on roles, because they're skeptical that ASEAN, in its current structures, has the ability to manage a lot more than it already does, right? So, yeah, if that answers your question.
Maybe I don't know whether this helps, but I remember back in, I think, early 2000, there's 2 management gurus wrote a book called Co-opetition. I don't know, anybody has heard about that? It's actually a combination of cooperation and competition. So I think that sometimes that's the way things are, right? In this world today, you cooperate when you think it's desirable to do so, mutual, but you also compete at the same time. And I think these two coexist. And to how much you want to put, into your competition bag or competition bag, that of course depends on your interest and what's your ultimate goal. And each, of course, has its different. And what I'm trying to say is, like, whether it's Mekong level or ASEAN level, this is at play. And so I guess from a donor, you will say, all right, do you think having ASEAN is better than not having ASEAN? Yeah? to manage all these things. And then, of course, ASEAN also have to say, is it better to engage with so-and-so or not to so-and-so? You see, so it's this kind of a fluid, dynamic kind of thing that needs to be worked out. But I mean, to me, just like taking the case of the Mekong, people often, especially NGOs, will immediately say, we don't want to build dams. Yeah, but humanity have been building dams for centuries. They must be serving some good, right? Why would people still be continuing to do this? It does have benefits, all right? If it's managed and operated properly, let's put it that way, with the safeguards in place and things. So dam can be a good thing. And the clear case is that, just to use example here, China have built the most dams, right, in the Mekong, 6 or 7 now. So ideally, dams are to hold up water during the wet season to be released during the dry season. So you actually get a double benefit if it's managed properly as compared to with the no dam scenario, right? You're actually providing less flood, more flood control, or therefore less flood damage during the flood season, and then you have more water to use during dry season. Isn't that good? Yes. But then, of course, it comes with a cost, as we all know. So what I'm trying to say is that maybe if there's a scheme that, and I think conceptually it's possible, a trading scheme, basically, a benefit sharing scheme. In other words, China would release the water, during the dry season and hold it back during wet season. Then Vietnam should pay China for that benefit, or all the upstream members downstream members who get the benefit from China's, operations of the water, right? But then on the other hand, China has to compensate for whatever costs, social, economic, or others, or environmental costs that comes with that kind of dam, on fisheries, on other things. And these kind of schemes, from my water resource experience back in 40 years ago, we already have those kind of simulation. And now you have big data and so much technology involvement. I think conceptually it's no problem. If you have the right input, you will get some different options of output, okay? So then is to get the countries to agree to what is the level of compromise you're willing to compromise on. What levels of benefit is negotiable or non-negotiable, yeah? And then try to see if the overall collective whole can come to agree to a common sort of options or a series of options. And that's how I see it. It's both competition and cooperation at the same time. Yeah.
We have run out of time, but I think this was an important discussion. If you look at Thailand, it's clearly the largest economy in mainland Southeast Asia and the second largest economy in all of ASEAN. And it has had remarkable economic growth in the last 40 years. 40 years ago, per capita income was $482. Today, it's over $6,000. And so I think that there's a lot of lessons learned for the lesser developed economies who neighbor Thailand. And I think also this is a good opportunity with Thailand is becoming the chair of ASEAN to sort of have a more pronounced role, not just regionally, but in larger Asian regional architecture. And I think this after more than a decade of internal political challenges that the country's facing. So I think that this is a study that that has great value. I hope ASEAN leaders in Thailand and elsewhere will take it to heart. We do have some limited copies in hard copies here, but you will be able to find a link on the Asia Foundation's website to download it if you wish. It's at www.asiafoundation.org. With that, please join me in thanking Tom and Khun Apichai for his presentation, and thank you all for your engaging questions and discussion.